I have a question for you. How many of you would like to live longer, healthier, happier, and more productive lives? And have a lower risk of contracting Alzheimer's disease? Well, that's very good, because that's exactly what I'm going to talk to you about now, how you can do just that by following the principles of happiness that I'm going to describe to you, about which more shortly. In 2005, I had been working as a company doctor for some 5 years, going into companies that were in real financial trouble and trying to give them a successful future. And it was very satisfying when my organizational clients survived. But it was very stressful work. And I was very conscious of the fact that my father had died when he was 52 and I was 12. And so after doing this for some 5 years, I decided I should go and have a thorough medical checkup. So as I was pedaling very hard on an exercise bike in the doctor's clinic one cold afternoon in January 2005, a doctor came over, took a glance at my blood pressure gauge and said, "We won't be continuing the exercise today, Mr. Smith." And of course, I took this seriously. And I began to ask myself questions about my working life and indeed my personal life. Questions like, what was the point or the purpose of the work I was doing? Was I helping banks be a little richer than they otherwise might have been? Or as my mother used to put it very colourfully, was I at risk of being the richest man in the cemetery? And I began to think how I might change my life. Was I spending enough time with my kids? No. Was I getting enough exercise? Certainly not. And so I changed my working life. Instead of working with large organizations, I began to work with individual senior executives who were in between jobs, and trying to help them work out what role or set of roles they would be both happy and effective in. And now I've accompanied some 250 senior executives on this journey towards a more happy and effective role or set of roles for them. So I've learned a lot about how well-being works in practice. And I began to try and answer the questions I had been asking myself. What was the purpose or the point of the work I was doing? Sometimes I get feedback from my clients, and this is a real card from a real person, and she got exactly the job that she wanted, which of course made me very pleased. So that is the purpose of my work now. The main purpose is to help make people's lives better. And then I came back to the question that my mother had asked, was I at risk of being the richest man in the cemetery? And I'm very pleased to say that the answer about that now is there's no risk of that at all, because coaching is very satisfying, but it certainly doesn't pay very well. I now try and spend some more time with my family, and nearly every weekend I pedal very hard on that exercise bike and burn about 1,500 calories. But I've also been curious, and I've been asking myself, what do we know about well-being from research? What is it that we really know? And the good news is we do know a lot, and most of it really is good news. And my favorite piece of research was done on a community of nuns. And it was one of the first pieces of research in positive psychology, where we're beginning to think about what is it that makes people well, instead of thinking also about what is it that makes people ill. And why did they choose a community of nuns? Well, they chose a community of nuns because if you think about it, nuns have far fewer variables in their lives than most of us do. They live in the same place, they eat the same food, they do the same sort of stuff every day. And what the researchers did was they analysed verbally each of the personal statements that the nuns wrote when they joined the community. And they analysed them in terms of how positive or negative each of the statements were. And then they monitored the health of each of these individual nuns during the subsequent decades. What they found was amazing. The happier nuns, on average, lived a decade longer than their less happy colleagues. And curiously, as I mentioned at the beginning, they had a far lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease. In a much more contemporary piece of research, the University of Pennsylvania analysed the language on Twitter. And if you look at the map on the right, the red dots are how angry people are on Twitter in a given American community. And if you look at the map on the left, you can see how many people in the same community died prematurely from cardiovascular disease. And you can see there's a very strong correlation. So if in our wider audience there's a community of internet trolls, then they should consider this research very seriously. Because it could well mean that they're going to die before their less angry neighbours. Harvard University found in one of the longest running pieces of social science research that I'm aware of, it lasted some 75 years, that loneliness kills. If you're lonely, then this has about the same effect in terms of health outcomes as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's very important in our lives that we try and develop and invest in a set of constructive, supportive relationships around us. Control is also important. If you feel you're a victim of life, if you're the meat in that corporate sandwich where you're not really in control, that's really not good for your well-being. And on that day on the exercise bike in 2005, I decided that I was going to try and take control of my life, which is what I did. We're often in a higher degree of control than we sometimes realize. Even if we're choosing to be a victim, we're making that choice sometimes. So try and be more in control. Living in the present is terribly important. And for those of you here at 1 o'clock, we had an excellent example in terms of the benefits of meditation, albeit a short one. And if you invest in meditation, in interventions as wide apart as heart disease, chronic pain, anxiety, depression, meditation can really help. Relaxation is also terribly important. Harvard University found that a particular form of exercise that produces something called the relaxation response, which is a physiological response in your head, and that might include things like yoga or Tai Chi, then this can change literally 2,000 of your genes. So the right form of exercise changes your DNA for the better. It switches off stressful genes and switches on the more beneficial genes. Like many of you, I'd suspect, I'm a big fan of yoga. I did my yoga practice last night in the hope of getting a good night's sleep. But I've been practicing yoga for some 5 years now, and I practice twice a week on my own without going to a gym because I can't be bothered doing that. So I practice on my own, and if I mention this to some of my colleagues, they say, Mike, that's amazingly self-disciplined. How do you do that? And I say, no, it's not at all. I do it, I like it, so I do it again. This is what works for me. Or as my doctor said a good few years ago, find a form of exercise that really does work for you, and whatever you do, don't stop. I've been speaking so far about well-being mainly from the point of view of individuals. What about from the point of view of organizations? Here again, it's really good news. Happy people are, on the whole, up to 47% more productive than less happy people. We've all worked with miserable people, they just don't get anything done. And a very large study by Gallup had proven that where a workforce is engaged, where the people are happy, that organization is very likely to be more profitable. Coming back to that day in 2005, when I was on the exercise bike, since then, At that point, my blood pressure was dangerously high, and it's now very good for somebody of my age. But that didn't happen by accident. And being a happy person isn't just about being a happy, smiley person. It is about what you do in your working life and what you do in your personal life. And that will have a profound effect on questions like how long you're likely to live, how healthy you're going to be, whether you're going to be a productive citizen or not. So this stuff isn't always easy. It wasn't always easy for me, but it is real and it does work. So shortly then, in summary, we know from research that when we're happy, we are more productive, our organizations are more profitable, and that everybody wins. So the next question, of course, is there anything we can do as individuals to improve our level of well-being? And I'm very pleased to say the answer there, again, is a very clear yes, there is. I mentioned at the beginning the principles of happiness, and this is what you can do to improve your own level of well-being. And the principles are: find a strong sense of purpose in your life, invest in relationships, be in control of your life, not a victim of it, live in the present, and exercise. And if you do all of those things, you are likely to live a longer, healthier, happier life. I'd now like to bring this together through the story of one of my clients, Marco. Marco was responsible for several $1 billion in terms of managing the supply chain of a very large international company. And one day, the company was being dressed up for sale, so all, quotes, non-essential jobs were being removed, including, sadly, Marco's. His first reaction, of course, not surprisingly, was to be very angry. That was the worst business decision they ever made. I'm going to show those so-and-sos. I'm going to get an amazing job. But I was working with him, and we began to talk about his situation. And we realized, of course, he had a decent amount of money in the bank from his settlement. And I was asking Marco questions like, what would really make you happy, Marco? And he said, it turned out, what he'd always wanted to do was to grow olive trees and to produce olive oil. So he bought a plot of land and began to do exactly that. The second thing Marco did was to buy up some properties in Italy, because this was at the rock bottom prices of the last recession in Italy, and do them up for sale or rental. And the third thing he did was to use his area of professional expertise to help local companies manage their supply chain more effectively. And that was Marco's story. But the point is, if we consider Marco's story through this lens of well-being that I'm encouraging you to look at your own lives through, he had developed a very strong sense of purpose. He loved growing olive trees. He was investing in relationships. His elder son could work with him most days on the plantation. He was in control of his life. He no longer had a boss. He was living in the present, working hard on the plantation most days. And if he wanted a particular long stretch of exercise, he could take 2 weeks skiing. So Marco had found his own way to change his own life very much for the better. So, in summary, what I have learned from my own life story, from working with 250 real people, real clients in their journey through life, and through a ton of research, that if we are happier, we live longer, healthier, happier, and more productive lives, and we do have a lower risk of contracting Alzheimer's disease. So now it's over to you. The choice is now yours. Do you have a strong sense of purpose in your life? Do you have a good level of investment in the relationships around you? Are you in control of your life or a victim of circumstances? Are you getting enough exercise? Happiness always begins with a choice. Please choose wisely. Thank you.